Well, this is interesting. I was actually in the other room originally, and I thought, wow, a lot of people came to see me. And they made a nice dinner. I thought this was fantastic. I couldn't believe it. I mean, I like to bring the party, no doubt about it. But I was a little specious, I thought, the whole thing. So I'm going to be running a little bit off my phone here, just to look at my slides. Yeah, the title of this is, I don't want to say it's misleading, but don't have any expectations of what this talk is about because of the title. The title, of course, is Bitcoin more real than gold? And we're going to address that question. But the first thing to ask about that, and the reason that I'm even bringing it up, is that you get a lot of people, especially in the liberty movement. Like I said, I've been a liberty activist for a while. The liberty movement has been pretty slow, as much as it's been the main driving force in pushing Bitcoin forward. It has been pretty slow in accepting Bitcoin in the more academic sense. Because what happens is some guys that haven't been alive for decades didn't know about Bitcoin. And so, going against the grain with what they think is kind of anathema in a lot of different circles. Take something like the Mises Institute, which does phenomenal work, but at the same time, very slow to change. So the question becomes, what exactly is money? Because that's the claim that goes around, is that Bitcoin can't be money. And there's a million reasons for that. Regression theorem, there's so many different things that they talk about as to why Bitcoin can't be money, And the first thing, of course, is you can't hold it in your hand. Okay, well, again, let's break into what exactly money is. What are the properties of money? Now, a guy, William Stanley Jevons, who quite a few people came up with some independent ideas about money, but he's the most popular. He wrote a book in 1875 called Money and the Mechanism of Exchange, okay? And he laid it out to being 4 different properties that constitute money. One of them is that it has to be a medium of exchange, okay? Which this is popular. Murray Rothbard would talk about that, where, hey, in a barter system, which was the original form of acquiring, a good from someone else, is that eventually it gets to the point where, look, you can't give half a shovel, to someone else for whatever. But things can't hold the same value. Like a shovel isn't worth the value of, say, a flint arrowhead. So you had to come up with something to where you had an agreed upon value of what you were trying to get from another person or what you were trying to exchange. And so that's the first property of money, which is a medium of exchange. And it solved that. It said, okay, well, it's worth this many whatever. Of course, their claim would be that it's gold. It's worth this many ounces of gold, so I give you an ounce of gold, you give me a shovel. Of course, back, thousands of years ago, that might have been a viable thing to do. So the second property of money is essentially fungibility. There's a few different words. It all falls under unit of account, but fungibility is basically, is it replicatable? Is it something that you can easily, like a poor form of money would be something that you could easily, forge or mimic. So you didn't have kind of a scarcity. This is sort of where the idea of scarcity comes from, why that becomes a valuable aspect for a currency. Now, Bitcoin and, of course, gold have both, that's kind of the big deal with them, is that they both have a scarcity. One's programmed, the other is believed. So that's important. The third one is a store of value. And a store of value means, can it hold a value over time? Is whatever the monetary unit is it recognized? Can it stand the test of time? That's one of the beauties of gold, right? Is that gold can actually, it's pretty indestructible, quite frankly. Can it be a store of value? And this is all very basic, but it's important to get these ground rules out. The fourth one is standard of deferred payment, which that is essentially, is it actually recognized as viable? Is it, you could use the term, is it legal? And that's not really the most important thing, but because something doesn't have to be legal to be valued. But that's sort of the idea with standard of deferred payment. So those are the 4 things, the 4, properties of money that generally everybody accepts. And a lot of people think Bitcoin doesn't fall under these, and yet gold does. But let's talk about that a little bit. Actually, let's talk about the oldest currency that we know, that actually falls under all four of those categories. Now, the oldest currency that we do know has been consistently used, and that's an important word, it has been consistently used for over 6,000 years, which is a pretty long time. That's a good history to have. Also, this is actually a currency that even up, talking about a store of value, if such a concept exists, this is something that has, you could still pay your taxes with it in some countries in the 20th century. I mean, that's amazing, for something to have that much age, over 6,000 years of use, and even today to be able to pay your taxes with it in some countries, or at least in the past century. In the 20th century, you're still capable of doing that. It's something that's used as jewelry. It still has that. It's still very, very popular for being used as jewelry. Again, this is the oldest currency in the world that we know of. It also, oddly enough, though this is kind of unprovable, it's believed to have medicinal purposes, even in its 6,000-year history. This currency is pretty amazing. Also extremely durable. In fact, the one we're talking about in particular could hold its luster essentially easily for a century, if not longer. Pretty incredible. And also it is scarce, which is where everybody seems to find so much concern. Even Satoshi Nakamoto with Bitcoin said, okay, scarcity is a big deal, and it's kind of the first thing he addressed when making Bitcoin was to build in scarcity. But here's the problem. This oldest currency isn't gold. It's actually a cowrie shell. And they are little shells. I can't really show you a picture, but you've probably seen them around. They're kind of popular, obviously, because they're the oldest currency in the world. And whether people realize that or not, they're still very popular. And so it's a humorous thing about the cowrie shell, because we hear these arguments over and over and over again about gold, when actually there's something far superior to gold by those standards, and that's the cowrie shell. Now, the Western world doesn't know about that generally, okay? And that's okay. I mean, it's not something, it came from, the cowrie shell it's a mollusk shell found in the Indian Ocean, so it became very popular in Africa. And actually, it beats gold's, it's more than 6,000 years. That was just me kind of pulling a little trick. It's actually been used for over 8,000 years. It blows away gold in as far as, again, every metric that we measure gold as being valuable by, historically, it just smokes it. Okay? Now, the other thing, a lot of people will say, yeah, okay, fine, but we can't really use the cowrie shell for electronics. We can't do this. They'll go down all these lists of intrinsic value that gold has, and then they'll say, well, yeah, but that's why we don't consider the cowrie shell important. The problem is that if you're going to use those metrics, like I said, actually everything I use to describe the cowrie shell is used to describe the value of gold, particularly always the 6,000-year history that it has. Now, the problem there, though, is that most of that's a lie. Pretty much since the fall of the Roman Empire, around 450 CE, up until the Florentine Renaissance in the 13th century, silver was actually the standard of the world. Gold, there's almost 1,000 years where gold was not the standard of the world. And that's a problem, because when you start telling people, well, gold's 6,000-year history, stands the test of time. No, it actually doesn't. It's minus 1,000 years, so partly it's a lie in that it's actually 5,000 years, but also there's a time where it wasn't considered important. Also, take that 6,000-year history. It's like, okay, well, you've got this intrinsic value today that it can be used for. And some people that listen to my show, Sovryn Tech, might hear me say this a lot, but it's true, is that where were those intrinsic values, say it was 6,000 years ago? What electronics exactly were they putting this gold in? It didn't, they didn't exist unless someone wants to talk about aliens, which I'm not going to accept that theory, not by a long shot. So, you have a real marketing problem here in that everything gold is based upon is nonsense. It's not there. And that's pretty important to bring up because, and also because the next thing I want to bring up is then what exactly does give anything value? Now, this might seem pretty basic to some of the audience here. I know there's a lot of liberty-minded people here, and so the theory of subjective value is probably pretty common knowledge. And the theory of subjective value specifically, and this oddly enough was also came up with, a few guys independently came up with the theory of subjective value in the 19th century, but the guy that actually gave the 4 properties of money that we discussed before, William Stanley Jevons, he also came up with the theory of subjective value. So the subjective theory of value is a theory of value which advances the idea that the value of the good is not determined by any inherent property of the good, but instead value is determined by the importance in acting individual places on a good for the achievement of their desired ends. So pretty much, if it means something to you, it has value. If it means something, and so essentially any kind of currency, any kind of money has to hold value between 2 people. At least, for it to really mean anything. So that's the theory of subjective value. And, let's look a little bit, again, at what gold, what it actually has. Again, it's the same thing that, it's been used for 6,000 years. It has intrinsic value. But there's the problem. And in fact, most people talk about this intrinsic value because, like I said, I kind of disproved a lot of the history that they talk about with gold. Okay, that it's just that none of that's true. So now they want to bring up things like I said, the electronics, or I've even heard one person say that you can make a fork out of it. And I mean, that's mind-blowing to me, to say that you want to make a currency based upon the fact that it can be turned into a fork. But okay. Gold also has medicinal purposes. Again, these are somewhat debatable. The cowrie shells were also claimed to have medicinal purposes. What medicinal purposes a shell could have, who knows. And extremely durable, obviously we already talked about that. It's something that can't be copied, and it is scarce. Now, there's a problem with one of these, actually, the fact that it can't be copied. That is no longer true. Scientists can, albeit at great expense of energy, today can actually make gold. The alchemist's dream is real. So guess what? I mean, like the concern with Bitcoin where, oh, a hacker could get into it and could make more Bitcoins and then there's no actual scarcity. Well, scientific hackers have already cracked gold. Bitcoin hasn't been cracked yet. So score 1 for Bitcoin, right? Now, again, the whole thing with gold, the subjective value, I understand it, I get it, but when you get to the end of the line with gold, you really end up just coming to the conclusion that it's something, fine, because obviously they weren't making it into forks 6,000 years ago. We already talked about the fact that they weren't using it for electronics, unless I guess there was aliens, but, if anybody wants to start talking about that, you know where that's going to end up. And it's mind-blowing because you just end up with the, in my opinion, inescapable fact that gold's entire value and purpose is that it's pretty. Okay, now that's fine. Like I said, subjective value. Whatever it means to you, if it means something that's pretty, that's great. Okay, I mean, but you're going to base an entire, you want people that, they want the gold standard. Okay, they want everything, they want the economy based upon gold. But you're going to essentially be basing the economy on something being pretty. That's scary. I mean, to think that the entire economy is based upon just simple beauty, I'd almost rather, in fact, because the beauty is in the eye of the beholder. Personally, I think silver is a lot prettier. But I'd almost rather have it based on the cowrie shell, because what exactly was the attraction to the cowrie shell? To some degree, it was beauty too, but that's because it looked like a vulva. And if you want to look up pictures on your phone of the cowrie shells, you'll see what I mean. I think that's far more important to me than something, a metal being very pretty. I'll take the vulva. So anyway, let's move on with a few more of these complaints about Bitcoin. And I got a bit of a twist that I'm going to put on you in a couple minutes here. But then, so fine, you denounce gold. You show that gold just doesn't have everything that they say that it has. And so, and you're doing so under the auspices that you want people to get interested in Bitcoin, which is a great thing. You know, that's fantastic. And when you do that, they instantly bring up, well, what if the internet goes out? First off, Bitcoin does not require the internet to do what it does. I've personally talked to people that are using what's called data packet radio, which is just, you know, 100-year-old radio technology connected to a modem, where he did, on the test net with Bitcoin, he did a Bitcoin transaction. So no, the internet's not required at all. In fact, 100-year-old technology can do exactly what the internet does for Bitcoin with Bitcoin. The other point to bring up too is that today, look, everything runs off the internet. Banks, you name it. The gold price is highly based upon internet interactions, and I think you'll find that if the internet went out, nobody would have a clue what to do with all those shiny things. I mean, this isn't 12th century Florence. We're not there anymore. The system doesn't exist. Nobody's doing double bookkeeping by hand anymore. It doesn't exist to where we would just suddenly start transacting, oh yeah, could I get a pack of smokes off you for, you know, 2 ounces? I mean, most people don't even have weights or measures or any way of even testing. No one even knows what real gold looks like or feels like anymore. That society doesn't exist. So the idea that if the internet went out, you know, Bitcoin would be useless, well, big news. So's gold. So's silver. It's just not there. Maybe in a few months, maybe in a year, it would get back to it. But in the meantime, if you're really that concerned that that's going to happen, I recommend investing in toilet paper. Well, it's more usable, you know. I mean, I suppose you could wipe your butt with gold, but, you know, I mean, that's pretty classy, I agree, but... Not
if you also make a fork with it.
Yeah, well, you know, then I suppose you do need the fork, right? Yeah. So the other thing, you know, is that it's non-physical. Again, this falls under the same argument in that, you know, nothing gets done physically. I mean, even with gold, yeah, you walk into a pawn shop maybe and sell it off, but most gold handling is being done electronically as well. You know, and as far as money goes, I mean, it's all just ones and zeros. It's really all the same whether they want to admit it or not. One of the complaints that will be, you know, levied against Bitcoin, though, is that who decides the price? This is one where they've got me. I don't know who decides the price. And the easy answer is that the market decides the price. Yeah, that's not really how economics works. I mean, yes, the market decides everything, but as far as you know, price valuation, price discovery, there's certain controls on how that's actually supposed to work, and I'm not sure how that's happening with Bitcoin. So I am open to the fact that you know, that may actually be a problem. The other is that it has no history. Well, again, gold doesn't have a history. In fact, nothing has a history. The only thing with an actual solid history would be the cowrie shell. That's the only one that has a consistent, absolutely consistent history that goes all the way to modern times. Like I said, you could still pay your taxes in some countries with cowrie shells in the 20th century. That's amazing, and gold could barely make that claim. Of course, Bitcoin is not anonymous. That's another thing that people bring up, and this is a good one because Bitcoin at present moment isn't anonymous. That is a real problem, and we will talk about that a little more in just a minute. Then Bitcoin is not divisible. Of course, we've totally disproven that. That's not so. And then, you know, the scarcity issue we talked about.
For time for questions.
Sure.
Unless you want to give up on questions.
Is anyone going to ask me questions? I'm terrible with questions.
No, that's okay. I was just giving a hand signal there.
Oh, okay.
That's fine. We'll go.
All right.
You've got maybe 5 minutes.
5 minutes? Okay. All right. So let's move on. So pretty much, I like to think that in a very short period of time, we answered a lot of the major problems that you know, the people, the critics of Bitcoin bring up. And so, but there's a problem there, though, in that a couple of those we couldn't really answer. And so Bitcoin in and of itself actually does have problems, and I want to address those quickly. One of its biggest problems are what I call Bitcoin monogamous. And what these people are people that are saying, no, Bitcoin, only Bitcoin, no Litecoin, Litecoin's crap, we're not going to mess with that. You know, go down the list of all these different altcoins. No, not unnecessary. We need to have everybody concentrating on one area because there's just too few of us. Now, this is, you know, it's a valid argument to bring up, but it's also one that people give for the liberty movement, okay? Is that, well, you've got something going on in Austin, Texas, or you got something going on in Asheville, North Carolina, you know, but then, of course, everybody in New Hampshire for the Free State Project, which I'm a member of, will say, look, there's too few of us. Why don't you all come here? Exactly. You know, if your whole argument is that too few people, you know, there's too few of us to really be involved in it, well, then why isn't everybody moving up for the Free State Project if that's the whole idea? Because these same people, they wouldn't do that. Another issue is standards, and this is one I'll try and go through briefly, but software standards in particular hinder markets. They hinder growth of all kinds in the digital world. And the digital world actually isn't answered very well at all by economists of any shape or size. But Microsoft Word is actually a really, really great example of just how when something becomes monolithic and when something becomes the only thing being concentrated on, like people are saying we need to do with Bitcoin, you run into a problem. In fact, Microsoft's entire process, their entire thought process with Word and with the Microsoft Office in general was embrace and expand, meaning that they bought out all the competition. And in buying out all the competition, they actually held everything back. They bought out the spell checking programs. The original Microsoft Word didn't have this. They bought all the grammar checking software. All these companies coming up with great things. And I don't know if any of you are writers, but try using the grammar checking in Word, and it's a mess. I mean, it's an absolute mess. And so at best, a lot of commentators will tell you that Microsoft Office becoming the standard at the time set back the computer world by 25 years. And I think a great case can be made for that. And I think when you tell people, look, no, don't concentrate on any other coin, just concentrate on Bitcoin, you're going to do the same thing. So I recommend accepting any of these, you know, any of the new altcoins, as long as they have, in my opinion, an altcoin has to have one of two things. It either has to have a tremendous feature set or it has to have an infrastructure. If it has one of those two things from the beginning, jump with it. It's probably going to go somewhere, at least for a little while. And it's the whole point of bringing up the subjective value, even with gold. Like I said, gold's been accepted commonly in most people's minds as, oh yeah, no, that's money, that's the real thing. The whole point I'm trying to bring up is that nothing actually has value, because once you accept subjective value, intrinsic value goes out the door. And once you accept subjective value, then anything can have value. Litecoin can have value. Next can have value. Next coin, really exciting one. BitShares can have value. Ethereum can have value. All these things can have value because, like we showed, you know, most of the value that you've been told about are generally lies, and they just don't exist. Even the store of value. What do you mean store of value? What store of value? According to who? You know, the store of value means nothing. Like take with gold. The store of value means nothing to a couple of apes. They don't know what you're talking about. You know, it's not a scientific principle. You can't back it up. In fact, I mean, the other thing with gold, real quick, a quick story with that also is that, you know, gold is this wonderful thing. Well, when Cortez came over to South America, you know, I mean, the Aztecs just handed him the gold. And they're like, yeah, we got tons of this stuff. We don't care. Where was the value there? They didn't think of it as a store of value. To them, it was just what it was. It was pretty. And like I said, if you want to base an economy on something being pretty, I would hope we'd be more advanced than that. So, anyway, questions. Time for questions. Thank you.